The courtroom fell silent as 14-year-old Tommy Johnson's fingers moved across the keyboard with mathematical precision. For 14 years, every expert had declared him incapable of meaningful communication. For 14 years, his mother had fought a system that saw only deficits where she saw a difference. Now, in a small Illinois courthouse, Tommy was about to prove them all wrong. Judge Catherine Miller leaned forward, her weathered face reflecting decades of legal experience. She had presided over custody battles, criminal trials, and civil disputes, but nothing had prepared her for what she was about to witness. "Son," she said gently, "can you tell the court what you want people to understand about autism?" Tommy's response would change everything, not just for him, but for every child who had been written off, warehoused, or forgotten by a system that confused silence with absence of thought. His fingers moved steadily across the keys. "Autism isn't a prison. It's a different language. I've been speaking all my life. You just weren't listening." This is the story of how one boy's voice shattered assumptions, transformed a community, and proved that the most profound truths often come from the most unexpected sources. The manila envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning that would forever divide Mary Johnson's life into before and after. She stood in the doorway of their modest two-story home on Maple Street, watching her son Tommy through the kitchen window. At 14, he moved with the deliberate precision of someone who understood the world through patterns invisible to others, arranging his collection of smooth river stones in complex geometric formations that would have impressed a mathematics professor. The envelope bore the official seal of the Casey Community Unit School District 114, its weight heavier than mere paper should be. Mary's stomach clenched as she recognized the certified mail designation. In her 15 years of advocating for Tommy, official correspondence had never brought good news. The letter inside was typed on official letterhead, its cold bureaucratic language barely concealing the devastating implications. The district was implementing what they called an educational efficiency initiative, requiring students who hadn't met specific developmental benchmarks to be transferred to the Regional Behavioral Management Center in Charleston, a facility Mary had visited once and sworn Tommy would never attend. The notice gave her 30 days to comply with the transfer or face alternative placement procedures through the judicial system. Between the lines, the message was clear: surrender your son to institutional warehousing, or we'll use the courts to force compliance. Mary slumped against the kitchen counter, the letter trembling in her hands. Tommy had been labeled severely autistic since age 3, diagnosed as nonverbal and possessing limited cognitive capacity by a parade of experts who spent mere hours with him before rendering their verdicts. But Mary knew better. She had always known better. Through the window, she watched Tommy select each stone with purposeful intent, his movements creating patterns that revealed an understanding of mathematical relationships that most adults would struggle to comprehend. The Fibonacci sequence appeared in his arrangements, a complex concept that demonstrated cognitive abilities far beyond what his educational file suggested. The phone's shrill ring interrupted her thoughts. Betty Miller, her closest friend and a special education aide at Lincoln Elementary, had news that would make the morning even darker. "Mary, honey, I'm calling about that letter. Tommy's not the only one. They're targeting 8 kids from the district, including Susan Clark's boy Michael. They're saying budget constraints, but I've seen the real numbers. They want to eliminate the expensive cases and free up resources for students who perform well on standardized tests." Mary felt her maternal instincts sharpening into something fierce and protective. This wasn't about educational efficiency, it was about abandoning children who didn't fit neat categorical boxes. The district wanted to wash their hands of students who required individualized attention, creative teaching methods, and patience to unlock their potential. After hanging up, Mary walked outside to where Tommy sat surrounded by his stones, each one placed with mathematical precision that spoke to cognitive abilities his educational records refused to acknowledge. He didn't look up when she approached. Eye contact had always been challenging for him, but his shoulders relaxed slightly, a subtle signal that he registered her presence. Tommy's hands moved with practiced efficiency, creating complex geometric designs that revealed his understanding of spatial relationships, pattern recognition, and mathematical concepts. His mind worked in ways that standardized assessments could never measure, finding order and beauty in arrangements that appeared random to conventional observation. The irony wasn't lost on Mary. The same school district that claimed Tommy had limited cognitive capacity was being systematically outmaneuvered by a boy who understood mathematical concepts they couldn't recognize. But their ignorance was about to become legally weaponized against him. That evening, Mary called Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the developmental pediatrician who had worked with Tommy since he was 5. Unlike the parade of experts who had pronounced their limiting verdicts over the years, Dr. Walsh had maintained that Tommy's silence didn't indicate absence of thought. It suggested a different method of processing and expressing complex ideas. Dr. Walsh had been expecting the call. Similar letters had been sent to 3 other families whose children were her patients. The district was conducting what they euphemistically called a comprehensive review of special education placements, but the real agenda was cost reduction through elimination of challenging cases. Can they legally force this transfer? Mary asked, though she already suspected the answer. With sufficient documentation and expert testimony, yes. But that doesn't mean they're right about Tommy's capabilities. Dr. Walsh's voice took on a more hopeful tone as she described recent developments in Tommy's communication abilities. For the past 6 months, they had been working with assistive technology that allowed him to express himself through typing rather than speech. The results had been remarkable, not just in terms of basic communication, but in revealing the sophisticated thought processes occurring behind his silence. The next morning, Mary brought Tommy to Dr. Walsh's office, where a computer with specialized software awaited. The program displayed letters and symbols on the screen, allowing communication through typing rather than verbal expression. Tommy settled at the keyboard with unusual focus, his hands moving across the keys with surprising fluency. "Tommy, can you tell your mom what you were thinking about yesterday?" Dr. Walsh prompted. Tommy's fingers moved with increasing confidence. Stones follow Fibonacci pattern. Each number tells story about mathematical relationships. Yesterday, I counted 1597 raindrops on window, all connected to infinite sequence. Mary felt tears spring to her eyes. Not just because Tommy was communicating, but because of what he was communicating. The Fibonacci sequence was a complex mathematical concept that most adults would struggle to understand, let alone identify in natural phenomena. Tommy wasn't just thinking, he was thinking at a level that challenged assumptions about autism and intelligence. How long has he been able to do this? Mary asked, her voice barely above a whisper. About 6 months of consistent work, but he's been ready for much longer. When I showed the school district his progress, they dismissed it as facilitated communication and claimed it wasn't valid for educational assessment purposes. Tommy typed again. School thinks silence means empty. Silence means listening. Always listening. Always thinking. Just different language. Mary's heart simultaneously shattered and swelled. Her son, whom experts had labeled as having limited cognitive capacity, not only understood complex mathematical concepts, but possessed profound insights into his own condition and how others perceived him. Dr. Walsh, could Tommy testify about his own capabilities? In court, I mean. The doctor looked thoughtful. It's highly unconventional, but yes. With proper technological support and environmental accommodations, Tommy could certainly speak for himself. Though I should warn you, the district will bring in experts to claim his communication isn't authentic. Mary felt determination crystallizing in her chest. Let them try. It's time people heard what Tommy has to say. The decision to fight the transfer legally wasn't made lightly. Mary understood the financial and emotional cost of challenging the school district, but she also understood the cost of surrender. Tommy would disappear into an institutional system that viewed him as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be educated. She hired William Roberts, a disability rights attorney from Charleston who had built his practice fighting for children like Tommy. Roberts was initially skeptical about having a nonverbal teenager testify in court, but after spending 2 hours with Tommy and his communication device, he became one of his strongest advocates. The district's strategy relied on the assumption that Tommy couldn't understand or express complex thoughts about his educational needs. If they could demonstrate not just that he could communicate, but that he had sophisticated insights into his own learning requirements, it would completely undermine the district's case for transfer. Meanwhile, the Casey Community Unit School District assembled their own arsenal of experts. Dr. Harold Peterson, A prominent psychologist from Chicago who had never met Tommy was prepared to testify that assistive communication was unreliable and that Tommy's typed responses were likely influenced by his handlers. They also brought in budget analysts to argue that the cost of Tommy's individualized education plan was unsustainable for a rural district. The case attracted attention beyond Casey's borders. Parents from neighboring districts began watching the proceedings, recognizing that the outcome would set precedents for how students with autism were treated throughout rural Illinois. The Regional Behavioral Management Center, facing scrutiny about their methods and outcomes, quietly began implementing communication-focused programs in anticipation of potential changes. As the hearing date approached, Mary found herself torn between hope and terror. Hope that Tommy would finally be heard and understood. Terror that the legal system would fail him as every other system had failed him before. Tommy seemed to sense the approaching significance of the court date. His stone arrangements became more complex, incorporating new patterns that Dr. Walsh recognized as expressions of mathematical concepts typically taught at the college level. He was preparing in his own way, organizing his thoughts through the medium that had always made sense to him. The weekend before the hearing, Mary found Tommy at his bedroom window, typing on his communication device while watching the autumn leaves fall in patterns that only he could decipher. When she approached, he had already composed a message. "MOM, I'm ready to speak. Been waiting 14 years to tell them who I really am. Not broken, not empty, just different. Autism is my language, not my limitation." Mary realized that the hearing wasn't just about preventing Tommy's transfer to the regional center. It was about challenging fundamental assumptions about autism, intelligence, and human potential. Tommy was about to become the voice for every child who had been underestimated, warehoused, or forgotten by systems that confused different with deficient. The weeks leading up to the hearing transformed Mary's house into a war room of legal briefs, medical records, and educational documentation. William Roberts spread case files across her dining room table, building a comprehensive argument that would challenge not just the district's decision about Tommy, but their entire approach to special education. Roberts had discovered that the Casey Community Unit School District's Educational Efficiency Initiative was part of a broader cost-cutting strategy that targeted their most expensive special education students. Internal memos, obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, revealed that the district calculated Tommy's individualized education plan cost them approximately $48,000 annually, nearly twice the per-pupil average. The Regional Behavioral Management Center offered to house students like Tommy for $28,000 per year, creating a financial incentive for the district to classify challenging students as untreatable within mainstream educational settings. The efficiency wasn't educational, it was purely economic. Dr. Walsh worked intensively with Tommy during this preparation period, not to coach him for testimony, but to expand his communication capabilities and build his confidence in expressing complex ideas. Their sessions revealed the extraordinary depth of Tommy's understanding across multiple subjects. Tommy demonstrated knowledge of advanced mathematics, including calculus concepts and statistical analysis. He showed understanding of scientific principles, often making connections between seemingly unrelated phenomena. Most remarkably, he displayed sophisticated emotional intelligence, recognizing the motivations and feelings of people around him with startling accuracy. Tommy sees patterns that others miss, Dr. Walsh explained to Roberts during one strategy session. He understands human behavior as a complex system with predictable elements. He knows exactly what this hearing represents, not just for him, but for other kids like him. The district's preparation followed a different strategy. They assembled a team of experts who had never met Tommy but were prepared to testify about his limitations based on diagnostic categories and statistical probabilities. Their case would argue that nonverbal autistic students couldn't meaningfully participate in traditional educational settings, regardless of individual capabilities. Dr. Peterson, their primary expert witness, had published extensively on autism and educational policy. His research emphasized containment strategies for managing disruptive behaviors rather than approaches for unlocking potential. He viewed assistive communication technology with skepticism, considering it unreliable for legal proceedings. The district also prepared character witnesses, teachers, and administrators who would testify about Tommy's behavioral challenges in classroom settings. They would describe his stymieing behaviors, his difficulty with transitions, and his apparent disconnection from typical learning activities. Their testimony would paint a picture of a student who disrupted the educational environment for others. What they wouldn't mention was that Tommy's behaviors often reflected frustration with inappropriate educational expectations rather than inherent limitations. When given mathematically challenging problems, his stymieing decreased. When allowed to process information at his own pace, his focus improved dramatically. When recognized for his actual abilities rather than judged by his deficits, his engagement with learning increased exponentially. Mary spent hours reviewing Tommy's educational records, documenting the systematic underestimation of his capabilities. Teachers consistently reported that he appeared unaware of classroom activities, while simultaneously noting his ability to solve complex problems when given appropriate accommodations. The contradiction was obvious to anyone willing to look beyond surface behaviors. The most damaging evidence came from Tommy's own work samples. When allowed to use assistive technology, his responses to academic challenges revealed cognitive abilities that contradicted every assessment in his file. His mathematical insights surpassed grade-level expectations. His understanding of scientific concepts demonstrated abstract reasoning skills. His creative writing showed emotional depth and linguistic sophistication. Yet the district's experts would argue that these achievements were either coincidental or the result of external manipulation. They couldn't acknowledge Tommy's intelligence without admitting their own professional failures and recognizing it. As the hearing date approached, Mary realized that Tommy's case represented more than one family's fight against institutional discrimination. It was a challenge to fundamental assumptions about autism, intelligence, and human potential. The outcome would influence how students with disabilities were treated throughout Illinois and potentially beyond. Tommy seemed to understand the broader implications of his upcoming testimony. His communication became more sophisticated, incorporating philosophical reflections on difference, acceptance, and the nature of human worth. He was preparing not just to defend himself, but to advocate for others who couldn't yet speak for themselves. The night before the hearing, Tommy composed what amounted to a manifesto about autism and education. People think autism means broken. Autism means different operating system. Same intelligence, different interface. School wants to delete programs that don't run on their preferred system. But different programs solve different problems. Need all types of thinking to understand complex world. Tomorrow I speak for every kid they want to throw away. Mary read his words through tears, recognizing that her son had become more than a defendant in a legal proceeding. He had become a voice for systemic change, a catalyst for reconsidering how society valued different forms of intelligence and communication. The hearing would test not just Tommy's right to appropriate education, but society's willingness to expand its definition of human potential. Everything they had worked for, every moment of advocacy, every breakthrough in communication, every battle against low expectations, would be decided in a small courthouse in rural Illinois. The Clark County Courthouse stood like a monument to small-town justice, its red brick facade weathered by decades of Illinois winters and summers. On the morning of October 15th, it became the epicenter of a legal battle that would challenge fundamental assumptions about autism, intelligence, and human potential. Mary arrived early, her hand resting protectively on Tommy's shoulder as they climbed the courthouse steps. Tommy carried his laptop computer and communication device, equipment that had become extensions of his mind and voice. He wore his best button-down shirt, a compromise reached after he had explained that formal clothes felt scratchy and wrong, but understood the importance of the occasion. The courtroom was smaller than Mary had expected, with fluorescent lighting that cast harsh shadows across wooden benches worn smooth by generations of legal proceedings. District representatives filled the left side, their expensive suits and briefcases projecting an aura of institutional authority. On the right sat a handful of supporters, Betty Miller, Dr. Walsh, and several other parents whose children had been targeted by the district's efficiency initiative. Judge Catherine Miller, no relation to Mary's friend Betty, called the hearing to order. At 62, she had presided over the Clark County Court for 15 years, earning a reputation for fairness and impatience with bureaucratic nonsense. Her weathered face reflected decades of legal experience, but nothing had prepared her for the unique nature of this case. The district presented their case first, a carefully orchestrated argument about budget constraints, limited resources, and the need to prioritize students who showed measurable progress. Their attorney, James Patterson from Springfield, painted Tommy as a tragic case, someone who would be better served in a specialized facility designed for his level of functioning. Patterson's opening statement emphasized the district's financial obligations to all students, arguing that Tommy's individualized education plan consumed resources that could serve multiple students with less intensive needs. He portrayed the transfer to the regional center as a compassionate solution that would provide Tommy with appropriate services while allowing the district to better serve its broader student population. Dr. Peterson took the witness stand with the confident bearing of an expert who had testified in dozens of similar cases. His credentials were impressive: professor of psychology at Northwestern University, author of 3 books on autism and education, consultant to school districts throughout the Midwest. His testimony followed predictable patterns, emphasizing the limitations typically associated with severe autism spectrum disorders. In my professional opinion, students with severe autism spectrum disorders and no verbal communication abilities cannot meaningfully participate in traditional educational settings, Dr. Peterson testified. The proposed transfer to the regional center would provide more appropriate services tailored to this young man's developmental level. Patterson guided Dr. Peterson through a detailed discussion of Tommy's educational records, emphasizing behavioral challenges and academic limitations. The psychologist explained that nonverbal autistic students often required intensive behavioral intervention rather than traditional academic instruction. He dismissed assistive communication technology as unreliable for educational assessment purposes. The typed responses attributed to students like Tommy are often influenced by facilitators, whether intentionally or unconsciously, Dr. Peterson explained. These methods don't meet the standards for valid educational or psychological assessment. We must base our decisions on observable, measurable behaviors rather than unverified communication attempts. When Roberts cross-examined Dr. Peterson, the attorney focused on a crucial weakness in the expert's testimony. Dr. Peterson, have you ever met Tommy personally? No, but I've reviewed his extensive educational file, including behavioral assessments, academic evaluations, and medical records. The documentation provides a comprehensive picture of his functioning level. So your expert opinion about what's best for Tommy is based entirely on paperwork, not on any direct observation or interaction with him? The documented evidence is comprehensive and consistent across multiple evaluators over several years. Personal interaction isn't necessary when the record is so clear. Roberts pressed further. Dr. Peterson, in your research and clinical experience, have you ever encountered a nonverbal autistic student who demonstrated higher cognitive abilities than initially assessed? Dr. Peterson hesitated. While there can be variations in presentation, the fundamental limitations associated with severe autism spectrum disorders are well established in the literature. That's not what I asked, Doctor. Have you personally encountered cases where initial assessments underestimated a student's capabilities? Assessment tools are generally reliable when properly administered. Roberts nodded. I'll take that as a no. No further questions. The district's presentation continued with testimony from Tommy's current teacher, principal, and the district's special education coordinator. Each witness painted a picture of a student who disrupted classroom environments, required constant supervision, and showed no measurable academic progress. Their testimony carefully avoided mentioning Tommy's mathematical abilities or his recent communication breakthroughs. When Roberts began presenting the defense case, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. Dr. Walsh took the witness stand with the confident demeanor of someone who had spent months documenting Tommy's actual capabilities rather than assuming his limitations. Tommy Johnson possesses cognitive abilities that far exceed what his educational records suggest, Dr. Walsh testified. Through assistive communication technology, he has demonstrated understanding of advanced mathematical concepts, scientific principles, and complex social situations. His silence doesn't indicate absence of thought. It indicates a different method of processing and expressing ideas. Dr. Walsh presented examples of Tommy's work, mathematical solutions that revealed understanding of calculus concepts, scientific observations that showed sophisticated analytical thinking, and creative writing that demonstrated emotional depth and linguistic sophistication. She explained the safeguards built into the communication system to ensure authenticity and independence. Patterson objected repeatedly, claiming the communication wasn't valid for legal purposes. But Dr. Walsh stood firm, explaining how Tommy's responses remained consistent across multiple settings and evaluators. She described his ability to initiate conversations, ask questions, and express preferences, all indicators of genuine communication rather than facilitated responses. Tommy understands abstract concepts, makes logical connections between ideas, and demonstrates problem-solving abilities that exceed grade-level expectations, Dr. Walsh concluded. He doesn't belong in a behavioral management facility. He belongs in an educational setting that recognizes and nurtures his actual capabilities. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Roberts prepared to call his final witness. This was the moment that would determine not just Tommy's future, but the future of special education policy throughout the region. Your Honor, I call Tommy Johnson to the witness stand. A murmur ran through the courtroom. In 15 years of presiding over legal proceedings, Judge Miller had never seen a nonverbal autistic teenager testify on his own behalf. The bailiff brought over a small table for Tommy's laptop and communication device, while Dr. Walsh helped him get settled. Tommy's hands fluttered nervously, stemming behavior that typically increased when he was stressed, but he managed to position himself at the keyboard. The courtroom fell silent as everyone waited to see if this unprecedented testimony would validate or discredit everything the defense had claimed about his capabilities. Roberts began gently, recognizing that Tommy's success would depend on feeling safe and supported rather than interrogated. Tommy, can you tell the court your name? Tommy's fingers moved across the keyboard with deliberate precision. Tommy Johnson. Age 14. Born March 15, 2009. Live on Maple Street in KC with MOM. The immediate, coherent response surprised even the district representatives. Dr. Peterson leaned forward, clearly taken aback by the speed and accuracy of Tommy's communication. Tommy, do you understand why we're here today? Yes. People want to send me to a place where nobody expects anything from me. They think I'm broken. They think autism means stupid. Autism means different kind of smart. Judge Miller looked intrigued. Son, can you explain that difference to the court? Tommy's response came quickly. Normal brains think in words. My brain thinks in patterns. See connections other people miss. Understand mathematics like music. Numbers tell stories about how world works. Different doesn't mean worse. Means different tools for different problems. The courtroom atmosphere shifted as people began to grasp the implications of what they were witnessing. This wasn't a coached performance or facilitated communication. Tommy was demonstrating genuine understanding of complex concepts while articulating his own experience with remarkable clarity. Roberts continued his questioning, building a comprehensive picture of Tommy's actual capabilities and educational needs. Tommy's responses revealed not just intelligence, but wisdom, insights into human nature, learning processes, and the nature of difference that challenged fundamental assumptions about autism and education. The district's attorney attempted to discredit Tommy's testimony, but each challenge only revealed the depth of his understanding. When questioned about the authenticity of his communication, Tommy responded with mathematical proofs and scientific observations that no facilitator could have influenced. When pressed about his educational needs, he provided detailed explanations of how different teaching methods affected his learning. The most powerful moment came when Judge Miller asked Tommy directly about his educational goals. Tommy, what do you want to happen with your schooling? Tommy's response would be remembered by everyone in the courtroom. Want to learn. Want teachers who understand that different doesn't mean defective. Want to study mathematics and science. Want to help other kids like me understand their brains are valuable too. Don't want to be hidden where nobody expects greatness." The courtroom fell silent as the implications of Tommy's words sank in. This wasn't just about one student's educational placement. It was about society's willingness to recognize and nurture different forms of intelligence and communication. Judge Miller's decision would reshape special education policy throughout Illinois. But first, she had more questions for the remarkable young man who had challenged everyone's assumptions about autism and human potential. Judge Miller's questioning of Tommy continued for nearly an hour, each exchange revealing new layers of his cognitive abilities and emotional understanding. The courtroom had become a classroom, with Tommy serving as an unlikely teacher about autism, intelligence, and the nature of human potential. Patterson, the district's attorney, made one final attempt to discredit Tommy's testimony. "Your Honor, we maintain that this type of communication is unreliable for legal purposes. There's no way to verify that these responses are genuinely from the student rather than influenced by his handlers." Judge Miller looked directly at Tommy. "Son, can you tell me something about yourself that nobody else in this room would know?" Tommy's hands moved steadily across the keyboard. "Last night, I discovered that sounds from heating system in our house follow mathematical pattern. Counted intervals between clicks. Found Fibonacci sequence and timing. Stayed awake until 3 a.m. documenting because it was beautiful. MOM found me asleep on floor by heat register this morning with notebook full of numbers." Mary felt tears streaming down her face. She had indeed found Tommy asleep on the floor that morning, surrounded by handwritten calculations she hadn't understood. Now she realized he had been documenting mathematical patterns and household sounds, a discovery that no one else could have influenced or predicted. Judge Miller nodded thoughtfully. "Tommy, what would you like people to understand about autism? Autism isn't disease to cure. It's different operating system. Same intelligence, different interface. World needs all kinds of thinking. Problems too complex for just one type of mind. People want to delete programs that don't run on their preferred system. But different programs solve different problems. Diversity makes systems stronger." The courtroom was completely silent as Tommy's words hung in the air. Judge Miller had presided over thousands of cases, but she had never heard testimony that so clearly articulated the value of human diversity and the dangers of institutional conformity. Patterson made one last objection. "Your Honor, regardless of this student's communication abilities, the district's financial constraints are real. The cost of individualized education plans for students like Tommy is unsustainable." Judge Miller's expression hardened. "Counselor, I've reviewed your district's budget documents. You spent more on new athletic equipment last year than Tommy's individualized education plan costs. This isn't about financial constraints, it's about priorities." She turned to address the courtroom directly. "I've been a judge for 15 years. I've heard thousands of witnesses testify, both children and adults. What I've heard from Tommy today is not only genuine but more insightful than many adult testimonies I've received. This young man clearly understands his situation, his needs, and his capabilities better than the experts who have never met him." Judge Miller's voice carried the authority of someone who had seen enough legal proceedings to recognize truth when she heard it. "Furthermore, I'm troubled by the systematic attempt to warehouse students whose communication styles don't fit conventional expectations. Tommy has demonstrated not only intellectual capacity but remarkable self-awareness and advocacy skills. Any educational system that would discard such potential is failing not just individual students but society as a whole." The judge's decision came swiftly and decisively. The district's motion to transfer Tommy to the regional center is denied. Moreover, I'm ordering the district to work with Dr. Walsh and Tommy's educational team to develop an individualized program that recognizes his actual capabilities rather than their assumptions about his limitations. But Judge Miller wasn't finished. "I'm also ordering a comprehensive review of the district's special education policies, with particular attention to how students with autism are assessed and served. The court will monitor compliance with these orders, and any future attempts to transfer students without proper evaluation of their actual capabilities will face judicial scrutiny." The victory was immediate and profound, but its implications would ripple through the educational system for years to come. Tommy had not only secured his own educational future, but had forced a fundamental reconsideration of how society valued different forms of intelligence and communication. As the courtroom emptied, Mary found herself surrounded by other parents whose children had been targeted by the district's efficiency initiative. The hearing had given them hope that their own battles could be won, that their children's potential could be recognized and nurtured rather than dismissed and discarded. Dr. Walsh approached Tommy, who was still seated at his communication device, typing what appeared to be reflections on the day's events. "Tommy, how does it feel to be heard?" she asked. His response came quickly, like finally being seen as human instead of problem. "Like my thoughts matter. Like autism isn't prison, but different doorway to understanding world." He paused, then added, "Been speaking all my life. Just needed right microphone." The weeks following the hearing brought changes that extended far beyond Tommy's individual case. Word of his testimony spread through the special education community like wildfire, carried by advocates, parents, and educators who recognized its significance for countless other students. The Casey Community Unit School District found itself under intense scrutiny from the Illinois State Board of Education. Judge Miller's ordered review of their special education policies revealed systemic problems that extended beyond Tommy's case. The district had been routinely underestimating students with autism, relying on outdated assessment methods that failed to recognize different forms of intelligence and communication. Dr. Peterson, whose testimony had been so thoroughly discredited by Tommy's performance, found his reputation within the autism community severely damaged. His research methods and conclusions faced increased scrutiny from colleagues who began questioning the assumptions underlying his work. The Northwestern University Psychology Department quietly distanced itself from his more controversial positions. Meanwhile, the Regional Behavioral Management Center in Charleston faced its own reckoning. State investigators discovered that many students placed their possessed capabilities that had never been properly assessed or developed. The facility began implementing communication-focused programs and individualized educational approaches that recognized students as learners rather than simply cases to be managed. Tommy's success inspired other families to challenge their children's educational placements. Roberts found himself handling similar cases throughout central Illinois, each one building on the precedent established by Tommy's testimony. The legal landscape for special education was shifting, with courts increasingly willing to question expert opinions that weren't based on direct observation and assessment. Dr. Walsh initiated a research program documenting the communication abilities of nonverbal autistic students. Her preliminary findings suggested that many students possessed cognitive abilities that far exceeded their educational records. The research challenged fundamental assumptions about autism and intelligence, providing scientific support for more inclusive and individualized educational approaches. Back in Casey, Tommy's school experience transformed dramatically. The district assigned him to work with Jennifer Martinez, a special education teacher who had been advocating for more inclusive approaches to autism education. Under her guidance, Tommy flourished in ways that validated everything Mary had believed about his potential. Tommy's mathematical abilities were finally recognized and nurtured. He began working with advanced concepts typically taught at the high school level, solving problems that challenged his intellect while building confidence in his capabilities. His teachers learned to accommodate his sensory needs and communication style while maintaining high academic expectations. More importantly, Tommy became a mentor to other students with autism. His communication device allowed him to share strategies for managing sensory overload, techniques for expressing complex thoughts, and encouragement for students who felt isolated by their differences. He was living proof that autism didn't limit potential, it simply required different approaches to unlock it. The transformation extended to Tommy's relationship with his neurotypical peers. As his communication abilities became more widely known, students began seeking him out for help with mathematics and science. His unique perspective on problem-solving proved valuable in group projects and collaborative learning situations. Tommy's advocacy work grew beyond his immediate school environment. He began corresponding with other autistic students throughout Illinois, sharing his experiences and encouraging them to develop their own communication skills. His story had become a beacon of hope for families struggling with similar challenges. The impact on Casey's broader community was equally significant. Local businesses began hiring individuals with disabilities, recognizing that different perspectives and abilities could contribute to their success. The town's understanding of autism evolved from viewing it as a deficit to recognizing it as a different form of human diversity. Mary found herself transformed by the experience as well. Her advocacy skills, honed through years of fighting for Tommy's rights, made her a resource for other families navigating the special education system. She began speaking at conferences and training sessions, sharing Tommy's story and the lessons learned from their legal victory. The financial implications of the court decision also proved significant. The Casey Community Unit School District discovered that properly serving students with autism in inclusive settings cost less than warehousing them in institutional facilities. When students received appropriate support and educational opportunities, their long-term outcomes improved dramatically, reducing the need for costly interventions later in life. Tommy's story attracted attention from national disability rights organizations, who recognized its significance for special education policy throughout the United States. His testimony had demonstrated that assumptions about autism and intelligence were not only wrong but harmful, leading to the systematic undervaluation of an entire population of students. As the first anniversary of the hearing approached, Tommy had become something he never expected, a symbol of hope for families facing similar challenges. His story proved that with appropriate support, recognition, and expectations, students with autism could achieve remarkable things. But perhaps the most important transformation was in Tommy himself. The boy who had been labeled as having limited cognitive capacity had discovered his own voice and used it to advocate not just for himself but for others who face similar challenges. He had proven that silence doesn't equal absence of thought, that different doesn't mean deficient, and that every person possesses potential waiting to be recognized and developed. Tommy's journey from a student facing institutional warehousing to a powerful advocate for change illustrated the importance of never giving up on human potential. His story would continue to inspire families, educators, and policymakers to question their assumptions and create more inclusive, understanding communities. The autumn sun streamed through the windows of the University of Illinois Mathematics building as Tommy Johnson, now 19, prepared for his senior thesis presentation. The same young man who had been threatened with institutional placement 5 years earlier was completing his undergraduate degree in mathematics with a minor in special education, a combination that reflected both his intellectual gifts and his commitment to advocacy. Tommy's communication had evolved beyond the assistive technology that had first given him a voice. While he still used his laptop for complex discussions, he had developed a hybrid approach, combining typed responses with simple spoken phrases for everyday interactions. His professors marveled at his ability to distill complex mathematical concepts into elegant proofs, often revealing connections between disciplines that others overlooked. His thesis, titled Patterns in Chaos, Mathematical Modeling of Neurodiverse Cognition, proposed a framework for understanding how autistic minds process information, drawing parallels to fractal geometry and dynamic systems. The lecture hall filled with students, faculty, and a few familiar faces from Casey. Mary sat in the front row, her eyes bright with pride. Beside her were Dr. Jennifer Walsh and Jennifer Martinez, Tommy's former special education teacher, both of whom had remained close mentors. William Roberts, the attorney who had fought for Tommy's right to an inclusive education, was there too, now a friend as much as an advocate. Even Judge Catherine Miller, retired but still invested in Tommy's journey, had made the trip from Clark County to witness this milestone. Tommy stepped to the podium, his laptop open and his hands steady. The audience fell silent, not out of obligation but out of anticipation. His reputation as a brilliant mathematician and advocate had spread across campus, and his presentations were known for their clarity and insight. He began typing, his words projected onto a screen behind him. 5 years ago, I stood in a courtroom to prove I had a voice. Today, I stand here to show what that voice can do. Mathematics is my language, but advocacy is my purpose. This thesis is for every person whose mind works differently. Your patterns are beautiful, and they matter. The presentation was a tour de force. Tommy explained how autistic cognition, often dismissed as disordered, could be modeled as a complex system with unique predictive and analytical strengths. He used his own experiences, his fascination with Fibonacci sequences, his ability to detect patterns in seemingly random phenomena like raindrops or heating system clicks, to illustrate how neurodiverse minds could contribute to scientific discovery. His work bridged mathematics and special education, proposing new ways to design learning environments that leveraged diverse cognitive styles. As he concluded, the room erupted in applause. A professor in the front row stood, initiating a standing ovation that rippled through the audience. Mary wiped tears from her eyes, not just for Tommy's academic success, but for the journey that had brought them here. She remembered the manila envelope, the dismissive experts, the fear that Tommy would be lost to a system that saw only deficits. Now, her son was shaping the future of how that system understood autism. After the presentation, Tommy fielded questions with his characteristic blend of precision and insight. A graduate student asked how his framework could be applied to educational policy. Tommy's response was immediate. Education systems must stop measuring minds against one standard. My model shows that different cognitive patterns solve different problems. Schools need tools that map individual strengths, not just deficits. Inclusive design isn't charity, it's logic. Dr. Walsh, now leading a national research initiative on neurodiverse communication, approached Tommy after the session. Your work is going to change how we train educators, she said. We're already using your case study in our training programs. You've given us a blueprint. Tommy smiled, a rare but genuine expression, and typed, "Blueprints are just patterns waiting to be built. I want to help build them." The impact of Tommy's courtroom testimony 5 years earlier had grown far beyond Casey, Illinois. The state's Board of Education had implemented new guidelines for assessing students with autism, mandating the use of assistive technologies and individualized evaluations. The Regional Behavioral Management Center in Charleston had transformed into a model facility for inclusive education, with programs designed to nurture students' cognitive strengths rather than suppress their behaviors. Tommy's advocacy had also inspired a national movement. His story, amplified by media coverage and disability rights organizations, had led to federal grants for research into neurodiverse learning. Schools across the country began adopting communication-focused curricula, and assistive technology became a standard tool in special education classrooms. Tommy himself had become a sought-after speaker, using virtual platforms to share his insights with educators, policymakers, and families. Back in Casey, the community had embraced its role as a hub for inclusive practices. The local high school, once the site of Tommy's struggle, now boasted a peer mentorship program where neurotypical and neurodiverse students collaborated on projects. Local businesses, inspired by Tommy's success, had created internship programs for individuals with disabilities, recognizing their unique contributions to problem-solving and innovation. Mary had become a prominent advocate, founding a nonprofit called Different Voices, which provided resources and training for families navigating special education systems. She often spoke alongside Tommy, sharing their story to inspire others. Tommy taught me that advocacy isn't just about fighting. It's about building a world where every voice is heard, she told audiences. As Tommy prepared to graduate, he was already planning his next steps, a master's degree in applied mathematics, with a focus on developing algorithms to optimize inclusive education systems. But his true passion remained advocacy. He had begun mentoring a new generation of autistic students, helping them develop their communication skills and confidence. Through virtual forums, he connected with hundreds of young people, many of whom echoed his own experience of being underestimated. One evening, after a long day of mentoring and studying, Tommy sat at his dorm room desk, arranging a small collection of river stones he had brought from Casey. The patterns he created were more complex than ever, reflecting the intricate connections he saw between mathematics, human behavior, and societal change. He opened his laptop and typed a message to his growing online community. 5 years ago, they said I'd never speak. Today, I say, your silence is not empty. Your difference is not a defect. Your mind is a pattern the world needs. Keep building, keep speaking, keep proving them wrong. He paused, then added, "The world is a complex system. We all belong in its design." As he hit send, Tommy looked out his window at the falling autumn leaves, their patterns no longer a mystery but a reminder of the beauty and difference. He wasn't just a boy who had found his voice, he was a catalyst for a world that was finally learning to listen. Thanks for listening to this powerful story. Subscribe for more stories about the surprising ways people change our lives for the better. See you in the next story.